All right. One of the first things we did was consider what globalization means in its different components: economic, political, and cultural. Key characteristics of different stages of globalization. To this point, we've looked at the era of exploration, the shift from exploration to empire, the end of first wave imperialism, and now we've been focused on globalization 1.0, that period from 1800 to 1914. We've looked at enablers for these eras of globalization. Most recently, we looked at the motivations for globalization 1.0. In our final week of class, we are going to look at the consequences of globalization 1.0. Now, this is going to equip you to argue for or against globalization. Fortunately, we'll run out of time before we can really get to that predictions part, but we'll do our best with what time we have left. As we go through, I want you to keep in mind that the consequences of globalization 1.0 are a mixed bag. Some positive, some very positive, and some absolutely disgustingly and horribly negative. But as it is a Monday morning, some of you are already disappointed to see what we're going to be doing in this last week of school. Let's start with some positive things. Trade did increase, right? Despite the mercantilism that we talked about, which could really put restrictions on trade in many ways. It did increase by about 3% per year over the course of 100 years. Trade Ireland, thank you. That equals roughly a 2,000% increase, or you can think of it as a 20 times or 20-fold increase. And what trade contributed to the size of the global economy also went up dramatically, from 6% of the global economy to 14%, which is more than doubling. Now, trade in and of itself doesn't necessarily mean anything good or bad. Increases in trade, therefore, don't mean anything good or bad. But for the countries that were able to and did join in global trade, their wealth did increase. We can see that in the table. The countries that did the most to globalize: Great Britain, their per person GDP in 1990s dollars. I know that's kind of weird, 1990s dollars. Sometimes economists have to do the best they can to put everything in dollars in a way that allows us to compare countries in the same way. Countries like Great Britain, Germany, and France, right, that did a lot of trade, and even little Belgium, right, that did a lot of trade. We're going to see Belgium shows up kind of as a success story and also one of the greatest villains in this story. Whereas countries like Serbia that really couldn't get into trade that much, and Russia and Austria-Hungary that for different reasons largely chose not to, they remained much poorer. And with this rose standards of living. Not for everybody. We're talking about the West, and even for the West, we're talking about the middle and upper classes. John Maynard Keynes, who would later be famous for Keynesian economic policies that have been used in the Great Depression and even more recently in your lives during the pandemic and the Great Recession of 2008. Ooh, some of you are not old enough to have been alive during the Great Recession of 2008. Some of you. Well, no, I know some of you are, but I'm thinking like for the 14-year-olds, it's possible some of you weren't. Anyway, John Maynard Keynes writes, "The inhabitant of London could order by telephone, sipping his morning tea in bed, the various products of the whole earth, in such quantity as he might see fit, and reasonably expect their early delivery upon his doorstep." I mean, this sounds a lot like Amazon Prime, but 100 years ago. But if you were a wealthier citizen of London, you really could do this. All right. What made this possible? Well, some of it involves things we've already talked about. Global trade, global competition, but we'll come back to those as well. The Industrial Revolution is a big part of this. And I know you might think about the Industrial Revolution as an enabler of globalization, but I hope you'll understand why it fits better here for our examination. The Industrial Revolution was centered on mass-produced goods. Lots of people would argue there have been several industrial revolutions, depending on how you call it. This might be Industrial Revolution 1.0 or 2.0. Mass-produced goods were themselves made possible by interchangeable parts. Now, we take this for granted, but this was revolutionary. Doesn't sound revolutionary. It's the idea that one part would fit all of the products that were made using that same kind of part. For example, if we consider the Smith & Wesson Model 15 revolver pistol, the barrel, which is part number 2 in that diagram, would fit all Smith & Wesson Model 15 pistols. This makes it much easier to produce things because all of the products of a specific type or a specific model will use identical parts. Not everything is custom made or handmade. It's made to be interchangeable with other parts. This went along with and made possible assembly line production by unskilled workers. And this is the kind of thing that Marx is getting at, right? We've replaced craftspeople with unskilled workers. Right? They don't own the tools, they don't own the means of production, they just do the work. Again, for Marx, that was the key, replacing skilled craftspeople with unskilled workers, because craftspeople weren't needed when you had interchangeable parts. And you didn't need someone to do all the hand fitting to make something work. All you need is a collection of workers, each doing their own specific part to assemble a product. Whether we're talking about doorknobs or automobiles. A thing moves along a conveyor belt, and different people add their parts to the production. And again, it doesn't take any skill. What happens is one worker might have as their sole job putting the front driver's side wheel